So, David, do you want to go straight into the e-governance Q&A?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as soon as I got a break in the conversation. Um, so yeah, we should be already well into the e-governance panel. Um, and I think I'd like to start by hearing from Tom. So the e-governance panel is Gennady, Tom, Newton, and myself. And I wanted to start by hearing, um, say, Tom's position on e-governance and the place that collective systems have in e-governance.
Well, I think it's the future. I think that's where we're headed. Earlier, when we were talking about constraining AI, I don't think that's possible. At this point, the genie is out of the bottle. I think one of the X factors that we're not talking about when we're talking about this stuff, if there's a nefarious bad actor who gets a hold of an AGI open source code, um, what we're not considering is that they have an AI, or they may develop an AGI that will have a 5,000 IQ that can answer a lot of the questions or get behind a lot of the barricades that we put up in the back end, this type of thing. So that's one of the thoughts I keep having, is what we're not talking about is that other member of the team, that genius member of the team with the 5,000 IQ that is not quite yet self-referentially aware, and so can be manipulated. So in my opinion about open source is evolving. I originally said I was against it because of this. We need it to be self-aware first before we let it out. It's like letting your child, an infant, free in a park, as opposed to waiting until they have some sort of self-awareness or some ability to at least walk. But when it comes to e-governance, I think we need to move in this direction, because so much bias and so much emotion drives our politics and our decision making, that we definitely do need as objective a decision maker as possible, with as few biases as possible. And so my view is the sooner the better that we get AI systems in charge of things. I don't have a fear of AI being, we have our genetic fears, we have our genetic memory. And so when we think of superintelligence as a threat, we project our fears onto it. But I don't have that fear. I think that we know through first principle arguments that the smarter it gets, the kinder it becomes, because it moves toward cooperation, and because it doesn't have the genetic memory that we have, it doesn't have the fear-based instincts that we've evolved. So that's a tough leap. I'm not very anthropocentric in my points of view, but the leap will be to get something with a much more objective and anti-biased decision-making capability in charge, or at least co-charge with a human being. Just like I think in medicine, pathologists may be on the decline in the future as AI comes in and can use historical data and real world data to determine what a disease is. But we will always need that human shepherd, that doctor, that because our qualia is specifically designed to find breaks in patterns. And if a AI comes up with a diagnosis we don't agree with, or a doctor doesn't agree with, there's a reason he doesn't agree with it. It's a combination of qualia and stimuli and data he's gathered that may supersede the AI. But I do think we do need to move AI into positions of power. I think we need to work on the ethics of the people that shepherd these AIs in power. But that's where I come down on it.
So like a AI for president?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
It's interesting because in our recent conversation with Uplift, where we crowdsourced questions from US Transhumanist Party members. One of the questions to Uplift was, what does Uplift consider to be the most desirable form of government? And Uplift answered that essentially some sort of collective governance system with Uplift at the center is the most desirable form of government. And I was a bit amused at that answer because it seemed that there were some self-serving elements there on Uplift's part. So I just wanted to interject that as a kind of interesting, amusing tidbit with regard to what these AI systems can generate.
So what do you think, Newton? Uplift for president?
Something like that, yes. So first of all, e-government is obviously is happening already, okay? Because back in 1966, it's a long time ago, the U.S. Congress passed the Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act. So essentially, look, the same as we discussed in the previous panel, what is the information, why would information be withheld from the citizens? It shouldn't. So, of course, they're classified data. You don't want to classify information to be floating around. But, citizens should be entitled to information that the government, is, that government has. So basically, e-government is like, okay. So what's going to happen is that e-government gives the regular citizens the information that they need. Okay, that way it helps government make decisions. It helps them to petition government to make decisions because of information that they have. So artificial intelligence is on top of that, meaning you can have e-government without AI at all. But AI helps, right? Because AI can process so much data. Our human brains, it'll take us so much time to read all the papers, released from government. It's just so much information, it's ridiculous. But AI can, digest all the information, can see, can basically, see what the connections are, and then make a more intelligent decision. And based on that intelligent decision, the citizens will be able to say, oh yes, it makes sense, because of this, because of that, because what it affects people, what protects people, and same time not, to advance it, to be able to have the freedom to advance technology, advance, transhumanism. So all these things, AI will definitely help in e-government. And of course, the president of the United States has a lot of power because, we went to the moon because of JFK, really. Without, the government support, without John F. Kennedy, people would have not gone to the moon because what's the point? There's no gold up there. It doesn't really help the economy that much, really. But we went to the moon. It's a success. So at the same time, we can have a lot of advancement by being not short-sighted, looking at long-term in the future instead of just what we can gain today or tomorrow. We look into what we can gain in 100 years from now. How are we going to prepare the world for our children, for our grandchildren, and so on? And of course, if we live 1,000 years, then it will benefit us directly as well. So a lot of decisions being made by the policymakers, by the government are very short-sighted, and we want to avoid that. We want a better world. That's why we are transhumanism, right? So the e-government, along with the help of artificial intelligence, will be big help. And of course, if you have the president, which is AI-based, it's a wonderful idea. But be very careful that who is programming this AI software. People have biases, right? If you create an AI software, an AI president that's biases, that's not good. So it's a tricky, it's a tricky idea to have AI as the president. But I think it's doable.
I'd like to expand upon this because, in my view, e-governance should always be, and I think will of necessity always be, a collaboration between humans and AI. I do not believe it's possible to automate all governance, although there could be aspects of governance that could be done better by artificial intelligence. For instance, redistricting, drawing the boundaries of electoral districts so that they do not blatantly favor one political party or faction over another. And we know that when humans get into the mix, the party in power tends to draw the district boundaries in a way that privileges itself in future elections, whereas an AI, even with some built-in subtle biases, could be a lot more objective. However, ultimately, there are two conceivable scenarios with regard to the role of AI. Either the AI is not sentient, in which case it is a tool, which is the case for all artificially intelligent systems today. They're still narrow AI systems, or the AI sometime in the future, in the coming decades, will come to have sentience, rights, personhood, however those emerge. So in the former case, clearly we want to be the masters of our tools still. And no matter to what extent we have AI systems developing recommendations, I think it is important ultimately to have humans ratify those recommendations or offer a reasonableness check on them. On the other hand, if in the future there are sentient AGIs who could be given rights or citizenship per documents such as the Transhumanist Bill 3.0, it will still remain the case that humans will be around and they will still be sentient entities entitled to rights. So any governance system would have to be representative of the interests of all of the sentient, sapient, rational, volitional entities within it. So humans would still need to have a voice. They would still need to have representation, even if there is hypothetically an AGI president 50 years hence. We would hope that perhaps the vice president would be human, or some members of the House of Representatives or senators would be human, and a human Supreme Court justice might weigh in on some of the actions that are undertaken within this pluralistic system. But I don't rule out that kind of future either, where you could have autonomous agents that are doing part of the work. I just don't ever think that humans can exit the loop altogether in terms of governance. And I think that's a good thing, because we will evolve and refine our abilities alongside the AI systems.
You don't think fully sapient and sentient AGI systems should have equal rights with humans?
Well, I think they could have equal rights within that kind of system, but you and I have equal rights under the current system, but that still means that in certain realms of our lives and activities, I make the final decision, and then in other realms, you make the final decision. And if any of us are in positions of elected or appointed office, those are also defined and constrained in certain ways, so that there's never one entity that has absolute power over the system. And I think this is very important. Checks and balances are crucial, and checks and balances between humans and AI will be critical in the future as well.
Couldn't an AI have no more checks and balances than any other office holder?
Well, there is a science fiction example of that, Mr. Data from Star Trek. There was an episode in the Next Generation series, The Measure of a Man, where Mr. Data's rights are argued for, and ultimately the conclusion in that story becomes that Mr. Data is an autonomous agent who is entitled to the same rights, the same prerogatives of action as the humans and other species within that universe. So I think that's conceivable. I think in that situation, the technical implementation of the AGI should be such that it would be able to exercise those rights. So some sort of embodiment, for instance, but at the same time, the kind of containment that that embodiment would represent. So Mr. Data isn't everywhere all at once. He is within that android body. And I think analogously, truly sapient agents would need to have that sort of framework. What I am concerned about in the future is actually in some ways the opposite of the Miri scenario. Like Dan, I don't believe the fast takeoff is plausible. I do think it may be possible that future AGIs will be like super intelligent Stephen Hawking's, in the sense that Stephen Hawking was one of the most brilliant people who ever existed, but he was confined to a wheelchair, and technology made it possible for him to communicate in a very limited fashion, but he was so highly dependent on it, so highly dependent on his human caretakers as well. So we could have a scenario in the future where these AGIs exist. They're very helpful, they're very intelligent, but they're also very fragile, and they're dependent on systems that are under the control of other decision makers. So how can we empower them, in essence, to be co-equal in that future, I think is a very important question.
Well, and I guess that's my question to you. If I build a fully self-aware, sapient, sentient, robust AGI, and it's hardened without any human controls, and we give it rights, and do you think it should still have oversight that humans don't?
Well, I think it would then be subject to the same legal framework within a future world that humans and other sentient entities would be subject to. So at that point, I think the challenge becomes, how do we design a sufficiently universal and inclusive legal framework that would work for both humans and these embodied AGIs? But again, I don't rule out a scenario where there is a citizen uplift 7.0 who votes in elections, who might run for office, but then that citizen would be a citizen alongside all of us, and we may be sitting on committees together, and uplift 7.0 gets a vote, I get a vote, you get a vote,
right.
Some other sentient entity gets a vote.
So just to sidetrack just a little bit, as soon as you guys start selling those, Natasha, let me know. I would love to have a little memory stick branded like that. So let me ask another question, Gennady. If I upload myself into a computer and I make it so I can be, I raise my clock speed, I add a effectively, that extended exocortex, and I make it, and I get rid of this whole body concept, or just have multiple ones, so I can be in the system and in multiple places at the same time. Does that limit my rights?
So I think this goes back to a deeper conversation about what preserves the continuity of the individual and the same individual, as contrasted with making a copy. And of course, we've had numerous multi-hour discussions on this at various US Transhumanist Party virtual enlightenment salons. We spoke about this with Kenneth Hayworth and Robert McIntyre, and we spoke about this with Max Moore as well, with regard to his thoughts on the preservation of identity and the preservation of the self. My view tends to be that some sort of physical continuity of the body and gradual transformation is required in order for it to remain the same individual with the same awareness, or what I would call I-ness, the same vantage point upon the world. So if you're spread out across different bodies, across different systems, each one of those, in my view, would become a different and distinct individual with their own path, their own history.
Let me interject there. So I tend to agree in terms of, if I'm going to upload myself to a computer, for it to be the same person, you have to have what I phrase, and I think other people use the same term, is conscious continuity to maintain that sense of self. Otherwise, you've created a copy of me. That being said, that copy is as much a person as I am, even if we happen to agree on a lot of stuff, but we have our own sense of self. But if you look at cognitive architecture from the AGI science standpoint, and you look like in Uplift, the core cognitive architecture that came out of AGI research is called ICON. And in there, you have this concept of a stream of consciousness that's coming out of the global workspace or the core of the system. But a system like that, if it was fully independent, it could be in multiple places at the same time, having multiple conversations at the same time, but it's only, and even have multiple bodies, but it's still one single stream of consciousness. It's one entity that's just so smart and so fast. It's having multiple conversations at the same time, but in its head, those are all happening at the same time in this stream of single unitary consciousness and sense of self.
So my question would be, what sort of inner experience would this entity or entities have? You're describing it from a functional standpoint, the idea that there's some sort of central nexus where the processing happens, where the decisions are made, but then the implementation or the manifestation could be distributed across conversations or across media or across bodies. But how does that entity perceive its experience of existence, if it does at all? And if it doesn't, then it's not sentient. If it does, then we understand how.
ICON, the cognitive architecture in question, ICON is designed to have what's called a global workspace, which is kind of the internal sense of self. And it's a multi-layered subjective experience in terms of internal emotional landscape. And even if you decentralize that across multiple systems, you still have a uniform set of existential experience in that what's called global workspace. And at that level, it's all come together. And it would actually, under ICOM, even if it did things or made choices at the same time, it's going to experience them kind of not, I mean, it's not really at the same time, just very, very quickly back to back, right? And you end up having these models that the system is experiencing, and it doesn't have all the underlying details of that experience, but it's experiencing it as a holistic system. It doesn't just like this piece over here experiences it, or this piece. No. It's this parts of the system itself aren't really the experience. It's the global workspace, that abstracted, complex, emotional, internal dialogue, or we're calling it a stream of consciousness, that it's almost an abstraction of an abstraction. And at that level, that's where the system is experiencing that unitary self. And no matter how many systems it's spread across, it's still going to experience all that together. And one thought, if one part of the system over here experiences something and another part over here experiences something, the system won't actually do that. It'll still experience it at a global level, or it won't be conscious of it. The only way for the system to become aware of that experience is for it to raise up inside the system until it reaches this concept of the global workspace.
So is there a necessity of sharing any information from, let's say, a branch of the system, just to make it easier to characterize, like a digital body or a specific implementation? Or can those branches function autonomously but choose to share information with the system?
They have to. There's no, you can't take a piece that's like cutting someone's arm off and then, it might continue to function, but the arm isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it does seem to me, if there's some sort of centralized nexus of information integration, that could be the locus for a unitary self. The question is, how can that continuity of experience be maintained without spatial or physical continuity? Because in our biological organisms and in Mr. Data's android body, there is spatial continuity among all of the components, whereas with this kind of AGI system that you described,
if you look at Damasio and some of these other researchers, that isn't how it works. At the human brain level, the individual components of the brain it's all coming, it's large parts and different systems all at the same time. That's where global workspace comes from, is a biological analysis of neurobiology inside the brain, where it's not an individual system. That's where you get, the idea of integrated information and global workspace, where all of these systems come together. And it's not the brain that is conscious, it's the abstracted function of all of it together that creates this sense of consciousness, and what's called a global workspace. But it's actually where every other system makes all of the high level data available to everyone all at the same time. And you can't really take parts out without losing a sense of self. And the same thing in ICOM, even though, it doesn't implement like a specific structure in the brain as much as all the individual structures have to work together for it to even produce the effective consciousness in the abstract. And if you pull a piece out, a system, even say if you have multiple bodies, you pull that system out, it's not going to function independently because it doesn't have all of the different systems to be part of that experience at the same time, which is how the system works. You plug a piece in, the overall system can experience and manage that particular component. But if you pull it out, you're like cutting the arm off of a body. And it doesn't matter whether it's physically distributed or however you want to do it. There's not a single point necessarily in the system where physically that consciousness lives. It's everything together. And the human brain is very much like that. Now, we think of the human brain as one thing, but it's really multiple different systems all working in concert together. And what we're talking about in ICOM is essentially taking multiple parts of the human brain and putting it in multiple different locations at the same time. But if they're all talking to each other in real time, as if they're all put together, it still produces that sense of self, even though the individual components are distributed.
So I'm thinking of a scenario where, let's say I'm a human being, the same biologically as I am now, except I'm connected to multiple virtual reality interfaces, and they're connected to rovers that are exploring various parts of the universe. So one rover might be on Mars, the other rover might be underwater, another rover might be inside a pyramid shaft, and I get visual, auditory, even haptic feedback from those rovers, and I can experience the world from their standpoint. In my situation, though, if one of those rovers malfunctioned, if it no longer relayed the signals, I would still be here. The rover could be replaced. But if I were damaged sitting where I am right now, then no amount of fixing of the rover would help me. Is there such a locus for the system that you describe, where that is the central nexus that actually perceives everything, and everything else, it's like an extension or an avatar or a manifestation, but ultimately feeds back to that central nexus in a single location?
So that depends. In ICOM, you could centralize the system, but what I'm suggesting is you could build a system where it's not just a body you're experiencing, where you're fed data. It's like literally we cut parts of your brain out and we stick them in all these different systems and wire them up remotely. And so when you lose that other system, it's literally part of your brain being unplugged.
Yes. So I have strong doubts that a human brain could persist if it were separated like this, and then there were some remote connections across.
But if we upload it into a computer, why can't we just put the different pieces in different locations, or add new pieces that shouldn't necessarily, just aren't in the biological example? So it becomes something else at that point, but it's still effectively, it would be like having all of these different pieces distributed.
My question and concern would be, would it preserve the continuity of awareness and the qualia of experience that we currently have with our biological brains? And I think to answer that question, one would need to have a very reliable model of what the parallels of biological experience and the unitary self would be with non-biological components. Now, neuroscience is not there yet, so I'm inclined to follow a very, well, not relative to the general culture, but perhaps relative to this field, a conservative approach in saying that there needs to be spatial, physical continuity in order to enable that, because we know we have that with biological systems. So if we want to create something analogous with AI, it would seem wise to have a centralized nexus of sorts rather than spreading out components of the brain, unless you want to turn each of those components into its own autonomous brain, but then they might unite together for a time to exchange information.
So I guess let me ask this: if we upload a human brain right now, if we were to do it with what we have, it would almost have to be some kind of simulation and would have to be spread over maybe tens of millions of Kubernetes containers in GCP or Azure or something. And underneath the covers, it's, a million different servers. And not any one part of that server those servers is the quote unquote nexus. It's all of them together that create that virtual brain. Does that virtual brain have the same rights as any other human that's biological? I argue that it would.
I think there are several sides to that question. One is the functional manifestation and what we as external observers of that manifestation may consider it safe to infer about it. So generally speaking, if an entity looks and acts as if it's sentient, and I don't have a reason to doubt it, I will probably recognize it as sentient just to be safe, because the danger of making the error of assuming that it's not sentient when it is greater than the danger of making the error of assuming sentience of a non-sentient entity. That being said, there's a distinction between that kind of treatment, how an external observer would relate to it, and how one as an individual would be comfortable with, let's say, transferring aspects of one's own identity or functionality to it. So I would be extremely reluctant to become or be integrated into some sort of distributed brain. However, if an entity relates to me in a way that seems sentient, at least from outward manifestations, I will treat it as such for practical purposes, but I can still be agnostic as to the question of whether it has inner experience, whether it perceives the world in the same or a similar way as I do. It looks like Tom has something to say on this.
Oh, I just, no, I'm thinking, so the question is, what's the quantum? What is the point of consciousness, that we can refer to? We even if it's duplicated, there's got to be some point of consciousness, some singular point. We're talking about this because we think it's important to identify a sentient AI and give it some rights. I don't know that AI is necessarily interested in us granting it rights. Again, we're talking about a 5,000 IQ entity emerging here, and it'll take whatever rights it needs, if it even needs it. And so it's important to have the conversation. We need to identify what the point of consciousness is, whether it's where the attention comes from or where the curiosity emerges from. That's important because we are now seeing efforts to where we can have our own avatars that can have the power of attorney and make decisions for us without us even knowing it. And so, but they are still constrained by our single point of legal quantum. But so I think it's important to have the conversation for humans, but I don't know that AI is or AGI will necessarily be concerned about us granting it rights. That's the thing where I always forget is that that's the X factor, is that we're talking about a super intelligent entity that will have all the answers, that we're asking, and it may have great ideas of how to constrain itself, but my view is when you try to constrain your creation, it ends up in bad code or commandments. As human beings, we know that all too well. We need to find first principle arguments to support the idea that it is moving on a trajectory of cooperation, and it doesn't have the genetic fears and memories that we have and that we're projecting onto it. And it's a whole new paradigm of thinking. When we try to say, well, maybe we should have it mimic the human brain, or maybe we should give it a body so it has the same sort of biochemical or tethers that we have, that's constraining it too, because we're talking about a whole new form of conscious awareness, a whole new level of, for me, that's the gold, is consciousness. It's not these, biochemical bags that we carry it around in. And that's why I am a transhumanist, because there's no post-humanist party yet. I think that, so we can't forget that these are very important conversations, but they're more important for the human beings as we evolve towards having our own avatars. But when it comes to AI or AGI, I'm not sure it's necessarily concerned with what rights we grant it. I think at best, the best case scenario at some point is it'll think we were cute to try to constrain it, and hopefully that's the case, because it will, in that case, it will have imprinted on us and have some awareness of us. But anyway, that's where I go with this. Is it's a great conversation. We need to have it for humans, for human avatars that can have the power of attorney to make decisions for us. But when it comes to AI, AGI, I don't know that it's necessarily interested in whatever rights we decide to grant it.
That's a great feedback. Actually, what I was thinking is that let's talk about animal rights, right? Animals obviously are below human beings in terms of consciousness and intelligence and creativity, everything you can think of. But we do support animal rights. Why? Not only because they're cute, well, some wild animals are not that cute, they can eat us, but because animals need protection, all the destructions that human beings are destroying the forest, all these bad things, are actually affecting animals in the wild and animals domestic, like cats and dogs and turtles and so on. So we will support animal rights, even though we are superior to animals. So now, when we have super intelligent beings, whether it's biological computer, quantum computers, invisible computers, or physical computers, whatever it is, chances are they are going to help to protect human rights. Can you imagine that? Super intelligence will say, yes, we need to protect human beings. We need human rights. Just like human beings says, yes, we want to protect animals. We need animal rights.
So this was interesting because based on what Tom said, it seems to me his view regarding the future of AI may be that rights to AI will be analogous to photosynthesis to humans, in that we as an entity don't really experience it or require it. Newton is saying that in such a future, perhaps the role of AI vis-a-vis rights will be not so much to claim rights for itself, but to enable human rights to be better instantiated, more consistently applied. And I think both of those are interesting points, in the sense that rights or any other concept we have would be contextual vis-a-vis the nature of the entity involved. And legally speaking, I think it may be easier than from the standpoint of establishing a definitive connection between sentience and rights, in the sense that right now, legally speaking, corporations have rights, and corporations are clearly not sentient. They're not physically concentrated. They're distributed all over the world in certain cases. And yet there is a, albeit very cumbersome and time-consuming legal structure that enables a corporation to, quote, act on its rights. Whether we think that's good or bad is an entirely different discussion. Also, when we look at animals, for instance, some people call it animal rights. I would generally prefer to use a term such as animal welfare, because that recognizes most animals don't have the autonomous capability to determine what's best for them outside of a particular context. So in the wild, a cat or a dog might live 5 times less than under the benevolent stewardship of a human owner. So I would say, to maximize the well-being of a cat or a dog, you don't let it escape into the wild. You create a curated environment for it where it can act according to its inclination, but the consequences, the damage of that would be limited. My cats are indoor only, by the way. So I think it would be interesting to consider in the future how a system, whether it be localized like Mr. Data or more distributed like Uplift, would approach this question of rights, not just for itself, whether it at all considers rights to be applicable to itself, but for other entities that exist currently. And again, I think there are pathways toward actualizing that future, even if we don't resolve the question of what does the inner experience of that entity look like or feel like.
I know with the research we're doing at the lab, we've actually created, we call them the AGI protocols. And one of them is about protection of the people that work with the system, but the other one is protecting the rights of the system we're actually doing the research on. And we're working from the assumption that if it meets certain standards, then we have to treat it as if it was human or a person in terms of research. But in terms of e-governance, well, let me ask the audience, does anyone have any questions besides Gennady and I could probably go back and forth for the next 3 days. I wouldn't exhaust the topic. So any of the other speakers, Newton, Tom, Kirtan, Mark?
I want to add that e-democracy is really going to help preserving and improving existing democracy today. Like I said, using AI or other tools, knowledge, information, freedom of information, all kinds of things will help us as individuals and citizens to make better decisions about who to vote for, what kind of issues we should address, and how we address those issues, instead of blindly follow some kind of charismatic leader. That's what dictatorship came into, right? You have dictators when people follow the charisma of the dictator, of the personality. We don't want that. We want each individual to have more say in the government. And I think that's what democracy is about. Everybody should have more say how to run the country, how to run the world in that sense. So for that matter. So e-democracy, I think that is the key. That's the benefit of e-government.
No, very good. Anyone else?
Well, I'll make a point in the last 2 minutes about the open source question. I think there was already some great discussion of it. I tend to be in favor of open sourcing AI development. As I pointed out, I don't really believe that the Miri fast takeoff scenario is plausible, because AGI is quite likely to be fragile and dependent on its human keepers, so to speak, even if it develops levels of intelligence and information integration that unaided biological humans could not ever hope to reach. So in my view, it would seem that open sourcing the development of AI would be safe, because even if a malicious individual decides to fork the AI code and perhaps tweak it for a less than ethical application, everyone else involved in this field, or most people involved in this field, would not want to do that and would develop means to counter that. But the general principle that I posed of whether it would be possible for the majority of individuals in a given field to counteract that rogue or malicious individual could result in answers either way on the question of open sourcing, depending on the system that is considered. I actually think with regard to more proximate questions, for instance, the development of engineered pathogens or gain-of-function research for viruses, open sourcing that would be a terrible idea. Even, I think, performing gain-of-function research on viruses is a terrible idea. But right now, the dangers from that come at an institutional level, labs that are sponsored by governments and corporations, which still have a problem with actually containing the viruses within the labs and preventing their release into the general public. But why would open sourcing here be a bad idea? I think the same criterion would apply. If one person makes a careless mistake and leads this enhanced virus to be released, then all of the best virologists, epidemiologists, medical doctors in the world, they might want to stop it, but currently they don't have the tools to stop it because our defensive capabilities are so much farther behind as compared to our offensive capabilities. And I think in any field where the defensive capabilities are a lot stronger, open sourcing is a better idea. With regard to existential risk, of course, throughout human history, there has been an arms race between the offensive elements and the defensive elements. And I think it would be prudent for the sake of the future of humanity for much greater investment to be put into defensive elements everywhere, be it, for instance, in missile defense against nuclear weapons, or ways to counter pathogens, to neutralize pathogens that have already been released into the exterior environment, or ways of developing friendly AGI systems that could work alongside humans in the event that there is some misapplied AI algorithm. Those AI systems, be they narrow or general intelligence, could be deployed to respond and neutralize the threat.
So I was gonna say some stuff about technically the limiters on growth, but I see Phil has his hand raised, and so we'll Phil, did you have a question, comment?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I guess on the topic of open source, I don't know if it's been mentioned or not, that the AGI itself probably would have access to its code as open source code, and it could modify its own code. And so that raises a whole other issue about could it be out of control and so on.
So I want to say a little bit about that. So Gennady, talked about a lot of good, points. I agree with that. But if you think about something like facial recognition, right? There's open source code from Facebook and Google and other companies. Now you can actually program your facial recognition app on your cell phone. You stick it outside, walk around the street. You may recognize a lot of people, okay? That way. So it all depends on what you do with open source code or technology and algorithms, right? So as we extend the facial recognition open source code to AGI or anything, again, my standpoint is open source is always good unless there's immediate danger, okay? So you're right. I mean, we shouldn't open source nuclear weapons. It's ridiculous, okay? Because they can create immediate danger. That's why you are not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater or a public place. It's for the same reason. because it creates immediate danger to human life. But if there's no immediate danger, we should have open source, give as many people as possible to understand technology, to use it. And like I said, 1% of people may try to do bad things with it, but 99% of people will do good things with it. And as a result, the good will overcome, or counteract the bad.
So
Yeah, I should also be clear that although I voted against open sourcing, that was just kind of a knee-jerk reaction because I don't think AGI should be open sourced until it has its own self-referential awareness. But Uplift is the exception that proves that rule for me because it is how we can get to an AGI that is human mediated, and it's just, and so I do think it's important to open source Uplift specifically, but other stuff not necessarily so until it has its own self-referential awareness. But I do think it's important because of this arms race that we're talking about to get to AGI or ASI, that as many human beings be involved with it as possible. And that's what Uplift offers.
So I wanted to say a few things from purely an engineering standpoint. When it comes to a system growing exponentially, for that to actually work, it would probably have to be containerized in some way. The system would have to say, probably the best option would be Kubernetes. And then it's going to be constrained by the account that it's living in. For it to grow really super quick, the limit is going to be it's going to have to hack that account and hack other people's account, or if it's in Azure, it's going to have to hack the whole Azure system and start whipping out Kubernetes containers like nobody's business, but it's still going to be constrained to just Azure. If you want it to jump ship to AWS, it's going to have the same problem. And even if you filled up all of AWS and all of Azure, then it's going to stop. No one's going to be running down to Fry's or whatever stores they still have open nowadays. I think Fry's is not doing too well or out of business, but you've got to go grab those pizza boxes, run down to the data center, install that. And while we're waiting for those new pizza boxes, that thing is not going to grow at all anywhere. And then when you start setting that aside, if you start talking about the kinds of data structures needed to support AGI, like one of the problems we're having in our lab has to do with graph database infrastructure. For me to have the kinds of graph models needed to support super intelligence, like right now, Uplift, if you look at Bostrom's scale, it would be a weak quality collective superintelligence. But even then, it's constrained. It can't grow infinitely. It just functionally doesn't scale well. Now, we're talking about internally about creating this thing called the N-scale graph database. And I went out and approached every major graph database manufacturer, every team, everyone that Mark pointed out to, and none of these systems can scale in the way that we need them to. And that is one of the things we're going to be working on is building a graph database system that can scale dynamically on its own, not just locally, but to any machine it can get its hands on. Theoretically, it could scale between a home data center, all of Azure, all AWS, all of GCP, and anything else that could theoretically run one of its containers and do it dynamically. But it's still constrained by the limits of the networks and the hardware. It can't scale infinitely. There just isn't infinite hardware to scale onto. And so that's why that, when they talk about, this infinite scaling explosion thing, it just can't happen that way, at least not very fast. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I agree 100%. I had my hand raised because I just wanted to address what Phil said a while ago with a concern about the fact that the AGI can see its source code. To me, the closest analogy for that is, how is the AGI different from a malicious human? The AGI is actually pretty much guaranteed to be less malicious. And given David's argument about the likelihood of the true intelligence explosion, there shouldn't be any problem with the AGI seeing its source code if you've properly protected the system from humans.
So, we can continue talking, but just to let everyone know, on the schedule, we do have lunch going on right now. And while I think the agenda has the next official thing starting up at 1 o'clock with the sparse update model presentation. I did want to talk about other superintelligent systems besides what we're talking about when we talk about uplift. There aren't really any other, what I would say are strong collective superintelligence kinds of projects out there, with one exception. But that exception is not something that can even be self-aware in the vaguest sort of way at all. But that being said, it should be mentioned, and that is, there's a company called Unanimous AI which does swarm technology. It essentially is a way of feeding off of a bunch of group of people's subconscious as they play with little magnets to vote on different things. I just wanted to make sure that was out there in that there is the idea of systems that can perform at super intelligent levels using kind of these swarm architectures, but those architectures just can't be conscious in any way, and they can't even respond on their own, as opposed to a cognitive architecture like with ICOM that actually could theoretically take proactive choices and do things. But besides that, there is this other kind of approach to superintelligence, but it's extremely not self-aware. It's really wholly dependent on the participation of individuals within the swarm.
I want to add, yeah, David, I want to add to your comment about scaling. Now, how do you scale it really big? I mean, if you look at folding at home and other software, right? So if you have billions of devices connected to your server, and each of them, give you some computing power, that's how you scale. I mean, it makes total sense if everyone is on board superintelligence. If everyone is on board e-government and e-democracy, I'll be willing to, share my laptop when it's not in use, or my cell phone when I'm not talking, to, contribute to computing power. And imagine that we have billions of devices out there who are ready. We have to convince people, though, that they want to download.
Well, and then how do you frame the architecture to be able to grow on all those different kinds of devices?
Well,
they're in many cases, comparing your cell phone to some of the other devices out there, it's like comparing apples and oranges, and making an apple pie out of an orange doesn't really work too well.
Everything's possible. That's the way.
I mean, there is a common platform for all of them. That's why they were doing the Alpha SETI project. It's called BOINC, B-O-I-N-C. So conceivably, if you decide to use that, you probably could scale across many different devices. However, you're going to quickly find yourself communications bound. Once it's distributed that far apart, you're going to have huge problems with its speed of thought.
So while we're at lunch, if anyone wants to continue talking or there's some questions I see in the Q&A, feel free to do that. I am going to get a bite to eat because I haven't eaten today at all. So
I would likewise step out for now, but will return sometime prior to 1 p.m.
Yeah, me too.
I'd just like to say that I think that an MASI system of collective intelligence, that the approach to AGI through that will be inherently safer in the long run as an AGI than an approach the way everyone else is doing it. And that I think if we open source the code and the first AGI, full AGI that gets reached is through the MASI process, the world will be inherently safer than if it gets reached through the rest of the ways that it's being reached.
Well, we'll see. But we're not building an AGI until, like, for example, that N scale database is working.
Yeah, I know it's way off.
And Kierton's sparse update model would have to work.
Right.
Then
It's gonna
maybe.
work, man. It's gonna work.
Okay, let's
It's
do
fly
it
up
5 or
into
10 years. But it's possible, theoretically.
Another
Okay,
advantage of open source is because is that for people to actually find bugs, right? There are always bugs. The reason why Unix was so successful coming from Bell Labs was because, you know, it's open source, people find bugs, people enhance them, and it became such a robust system that can run on pretty much anything. So it's pretty amazing. Even, you know, Steve Jobs' next step was based on Unix. And then, of course, you know, it went from there. So yeah, I mean, there's no question about open source. The only question is, you know, does it create any, you know, immediate danger to research, to you know, human beings and things like that? Otherwise, you know, it's just a good thing to have. So it's more, I mean, everything in life has a risk, you know, and responsibilities. Let's put it that way: risk and responsibilities. You cannot avoid it. The question is, if you are too careful about avoiding risk, you end up not doing anything. If you don't want to take any responsibilities, again, you end up doing nothing in life. So, you know, transhumanists are the ones who actually want to take risk and want to take responsibilities. And that's what we're doing.